Hello and welcome to today's Take, hosted by me, Jane Azzopardi, the podcast that goes beyond the headlines and gives you the story behind the story that you see on TV. And this week we are diving into that military parade that was beamed from Beijing right across the world.
It was a deliberate display of an enormous arsenal and cutting-edge war technology, from robot wolves to long-range missiles, a military warning to the West from President Xi as he stood shoulder to shoulder with authoritarian leaders from across the globe. That is why Dan Andrews' presence is being criticised.
It's not a great message, especially when you consider that at least three of the leaders present there, Vladimir Putin from Russia, Lukashenko from Belarus, and the head of the Myanmar military junta are all sanctioned by the Australian government. And you could see Dan Andrews right behind Kim Jong-un, 3 rows back. So it's not a great look.
And now it is time to bring in our guest, 9 News National Affairs Editor Andrew Probyn. Andrew, welcome to today's Take.
Lovely to be here, Jane.
I want to start by setting the scene. For people who haven't seen the vision of this incredible military spectacle that happened in Beijing, talk us through what it looked like.
Well, firstly, if you haven't seen it, you've got to go and see it. It's probably the greatest spectacle of the year so far and might end up being the greatest spectacle of the entire decade. This was an amazing military display. We had a lot of precision marching, as we can expect. But it was more than that. It was immense. It was highly choreographed, and in parts it was pretty menacing. China was displaying all of its, some of its new weaponry. It had a lot of planes and tanks and marching folk. It was just extraordinary, and it's probably the best produced piece of cinema we've had for the decade. It was that good.
And it goes right down to the finer details, Andrew. I remember travelling to China with former Prime Minister Julia Gillard many years ago, and one of the things that struck me when they have those kind of military welcomes, every single soldier is exactly the same height, and that was the kind of thing we saw there. Everything was down to the millimetre.
Exactly. In fact, it's interesting you mentioned the size of the soldiers, because I too noticed that with prime ministerial visits. They're all about 6'2". And you look down the line, and they must be adjusting them in their shoes to make sure that they're to the millimetre. But that's the sort of precision we saw with this extraordinary event in Beijing. It was absolutely engrossing, and at times you're thinking, goodness me, who's going to top this? And I think that's the whole point, isn't it? That this was to be both in awe of and to wonder about. And so I think this is the Xi Jinping projection that he wanted, and he did it incredibly.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit now, because on the surface, the military parade was about commemorating 80 years since the end of World War II. But what do you think it was really about?
Look, it was about power projection, and you could see that not just in what was being paraded, but also in the company that the Chinese president kept. It was a whole host of despots and dictators who were brought in to Beijing at an invitation, and on his left and right flank we had none other than the Russian president Vladimir Putin, and then we had the man that Donald Trump called the Rocket Man, Kim Jong-un, the North Korean supreme leader. These two fellows were given very prominent roles, and that tells you about the way that China wants to see itself under Xi Jinping, that it is the centre of the new world order, and it's an authoritarian new world order. That's what yesterday was all about.
Despots, dictators, and former Victorian Premier Dan Andrews. Tell us about his sort of, I guess, controversial appearance there.
Well, it's more than controversial. It's absolutely gobsmacking that a Victorian Premier, former Victorian Labor Premier, should take and be given such a prominent role. And that's the important thing. Not only was he invited, but he was one of just a few who were given a very warm personal welcome on the red carpet. It's very, very deliberate from Xi Jinping, because there were no Western European leaders of significance at that event, and for all intents and purposes, Dan Andrews was the West being greeted and given some extraordinary treatment. Not only was he warmly embraced, but he was given a front row seat to the Xi show, and that was an amazing thing to see, given the controversy surrounding what he did as Victorian Premier, trying to sign up Victoria to the Belt and Road Initiative, which really worried the federal government at the time and was eventually scrapped by the Morrison government. So to have Dan Andrews there in such prominence is undoubtedly going to be a big talking point for weeks and months to come.
Yeah, absolutely. As I understand it, Australia's ambassador to China was at the other end of the country when this happened. Former Foreign Minister Bob Carr accepted an invitation to the country, but has made it very clear that he wasn't going to attend that military parade.
Well, I heard him say that he found out a bit later that there was going to be a Soviet-style parade. I mean, that just doesn't wash with me. The fact is, when there was last a celebration, an anniversary of this kind, the 70th no less, there was a similar parade, obviously not as extravagant as the one we saw this week. So Bob Carr, if he'd really thought about it, would have known there was going to be a parade. The fact is, the atmospherics surrounding not only the parade itself, the show of military power, but also the guest list, I think turned him off the idea of being there. But he was in China. He was invited by China to be in attendance, and he chose not to at the last minute. A bit like, it must be said, Modi, because as you said, Jane, this is about the 80th anniversary of the victory over Japan. And Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, chose not to be there because he didn't want to offend Tokyo, which is quite significant.
Okay, so there will be people who point out that it's not so long ago that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese took a week-long trip to China where he also shook hands with Xi Jinping. How is what Dan Andrews did different to that?
That's a really good question. Australia has long been struggling with this notion of being the close security friend with the United States, but then having an enormous trading relationship with China. In fact, China is our greatest trading partner. Now, that said, there are significant differences between Australia, the United States, the West, and China over the way that the security arrangements, the laws, legal norms, international norms should be considered, especially in things like the South China Sea. China sees itself as a power that wants to expand. It has and sees itself as being the dominant force. It sees certain borders that are beyond the ones that we recognise. It does want to be the one that shapes our region and beyond, and that is the strategic struggle that the world for the past 10 to 15 years have been that the world has been struggling with.
So in terms of Anthony Albanese kind of maintaining that relationship, but then the criticism that Dan Andrews is getting for attending the actual military parade, it's about keeping sort of the trade side and the military side separate?
It's keeping things sweet to a degree, but remember what the government, they say that they will disagree where they must, but try and cooperate elsewhere, and that's the nature of the trip. And I think it's going to be a difficult path for not just this government but future governments, as China, especially under Xi Jinping, seeks to muscle its way into greater prominence both on the world stage and in the region.
So Anthony Albanese and several other ministers and members of the government have faced questions already about Dan Andrews' decision to appear at that parade and in that photo. And the line from the government seems to be, well, it's his decision, he's a private citizen. Does that wash?
It doesn't wash. Anthony Albanese, he didn't endorse what Andrews did, but nor did he voice any criticism. He did say, however, that 10 years ago, the coalition government sent Michael Ronaldson, who was then a federal minister, to the event. But a lot's changed in the past 10 years. China has become a lot more assertive and muscular in its international diplomacy. It has supported Russia, for example, in the war in Ukraine. It has a very cosy relationship with Vladimir Putin's regime, and indeed is a critical partner of Russia. And I was watching, Jane, and listening to the Chinese state media's broadcast of what we saw this week with the parade. And there was a moment when Vladimir Putin walks in, and the Chinese commentator said that relations between Russia and China have never been closer. So that was interesting and instructive there, and it was obviously scripted. This was state television with projecting some propaganda that they wanted the world to hear. So that is the tension that exists. That is the difference between 10 years and now. And I think that it was wise to keep well clear of that event, because you don't want to be endorsing an expansionist power like Xi Jinping, especially when we have the security relationship with the Americans.
And standing 3 rows behind Kim Jong-un as well in a photograph. Let's talk about Donald Trump's reaction to this. That comment you made about China and Russia never being closer. He's recently had a meeting himself with Vladimir Putin. How did Donald Trump react to this spectacle in Beijing?
Well, he was giving a press conference earlier in the day before the parade actually happened, and he seemed to be, nonplussed by it. And then he sent out a message on Truth Social, which I'll read to you. He said, it's quite pointed and interesting in its tone. He says, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States." So there you have it. There's the competition written on Truth Social by Donald Trump. He sees this as a competition between him and Xi.
And do you think that's how Xi and Putin wanted him to see it?
Absolutely. This was about, and I know that perhaps you want to talk about the US military display.
Yeah. Well, it does, it does remind me. We've seen the North Korean military displays. We saw this one. I think it was on Donald Trump's birthday. Ostensibly, it was about the 250th anniversary of the US Army.
Oh, come on, Jane. It just happened to be on his birthday. Come on.
It's like everybody, I've seen your military parade, but look at mine. It's bigger.
It was like a Paul Hogan moment. Call that a knife, and he pulls out a greater knife. I think this was. It was definitely a very male moment, wasn't it? By comparison, the American and the Donald Trump parade, let's call it, was modest and shambolic compared to the extraordinary events in Beijing. But this is all about whose military is bigger, and it's quite clear that China is the power to be reckoned with. It's got 2 million people on standby with its military, and we are creeping ever closer to 2027, when Xi Jinping has indicated repeatedly that he wants to retake Taiwan. So we are approaching a potentially even more dangerous time, and that's probably what yesterday was about.
So as well as sort of the spectacle of the people all marching in unison, there were lots of weapons on display as well, including some nuclear-capable weapons with extraordinary reach.
Well, not just nuclear capable, but ones, as you say, that are able to reach North America. There might be a message there, Jane, I'm not so sure. And ones that might be able to reach Western Europe. What's that telling you? I mean, that is an intimidation. It was the unveiling of this new intercontinental nuclear missile. But, that's what is part of the show, I suppose. The nationalism under Xi Jinping is something to be in awe of, but it's also something that tells you about the Chinese psyche, that after decades of humiliation, some of it self-inflicted under Mao Zedong, that it wants to assert itself in world history like no other time.
So if the message then is to the Western world, look at how powerful we are, look at this alliance and who I've been able to bring here, is that something that the Western world should fear?
I think it's maybe less fear. I think first and foremost the Chinese want respect. I think they've got it. They've shown that they are not going to be curtailed by the rules of the sea, for example, as we see it, or the rules of international engagement so much, especially when it comes to the South China Sea and them asserting themselves. I think what we should be very conscious of is that when Xi Jinping talked about the fact that the Chinese people didn't fear violence, that we are now at a time where we have to make the choice between war and peace, or he said peace and war in those order, then we should be conscious that this is a man who means what he says. And that's why when America looks to its allies like Australia and says, what are you going to do should they come stalking Taiwan? What would you do, especially if we gave you a nuclear submarine? So there's a lot of calculations and strategy to be had, and I think that maybe we shouldn't fear it necessarily, but we need to be prepared for it, and that's why defence spending is going to be so important in the weeks and even months ahead when we're talking about Anthony Albanese meeting Donald Trump in about 3 weeks' time.
Well, I want to get to all of that in a moment, but I just want to take a little sidebar while we're talking about these world leaders, because there was a rather, what's the word, bizarre, odd?
Hot mic.
Hot mic, very strange hot mic conversation that was picked up between President Xi and Putin. Tell us about that.
Well, they were talking about the wonders of science. Now, you know, that's like any conversation on a happy... was it Wednesday yesterday?
Yeah.
Happy Wednesday, talking about the wonders of science. Now, it then went to organ harvesting and organ donation, and talking about effectively you can live forever if you can find the right organ. It wasn't just Putin and Xi who wanted to talk about that, but Chairman Kim, he was quick to say that he too was wondering about sciences and the science of transplantation. So heaven help those poor North Koreans should he have a failing kidney or liver.
It could lead to immortality, transplant. It was very bizarre.
Well, once a dictator, forever a dictator, perhaps.
Yeah, hopefully it's just conversation and we can leave it there. Let's get back to the message that Canberra should be taking from this event. What do you think that is? What is being discussed in Canberra in relation to China and this display?
I think the broader analysis is that China is not going to be taking any backward steps, that it's going to be more and more assertive, and that Australia needs to think long and hard about its strategic outlook, its capacity for deterrence as much as its military force. And this is the thing, I mean, you look at what we saw parading through the streets of Beijing. Australia wouldn't have a chance, let's face it, but it's the deterrence that Australia can achieve through its alliances with not just America, but now increasingly with Europe. That is going to be the key if we are to push against China's assertiveness, and that will bring friends together and perhaps strain a few relationships along the way. But we have chosen whose side we're on, and fundamentally that's the American side, even with or without Donald Trump, and we're certainly much closer to Europe and Britain than we were even 5 years ago, and that's because of China.
And since you brought this up moments ago, is Anthony Albanese going to get that sit-down interview or sit-down meeting with Donald Trump before the end of the year?
I think it will happen. Where it happens, I don't know. Could be New York, could be Washington, but I think it will happen, and I think it's because of that very dynamic that we're talking about, that America does need us. We need them, obviously, but they need us because of that forward projection. Australia's a pretty useful place in the world, and we're a very consistent friend, and even to people like Donald, that's useful.
Andrew Probyn, thank you so much for joining us
Thanks,
for
Jane.
today's Take. And thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed our conversation, please do leave us a rating and a comment. It all helps. And come back along next week when we will have another episode of Today's Take. Until then, I will see you bright and early with the rest of the Today team. Have a great day.